the inside story on the issues that affect you and your community. This is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. I'm Dan Hurley. For over a decade, Hamilton County and the city of Cincinnati have experimented with a mechanism provided by the Ohio law called Port Authority to lead economic development. Through successive reorganizations, the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority has gained responsibilities in several areas, including cleanup and redevelopment of brownfields and riverfront development. But not until 2008 did the two governments give the port the full authority authorized under the law. That includes activities that, quote, enhance, foster, aid, provide, or promote transportation, economic development, housing, recreation, education, governmental operations, culture, or research. Pretty big charge. In addition to the legal expansion of the authority last year, both the city and the county took actions to provide greater funding resources for the port. And in mid-December, the board of the port hired a new president. Laura Brunner is a certified public accountant by background who has worked for private real estate development firms. She started her career with Cady Short-Thompson and most recently with Alnair Incorporated. Welcome to Newsmakers.
Good morning, Dan. It's
this
good to be here.
This is exciting to be in this new position. I know this was one that you really wanted and really went after.
Absolutely.
So.
And now I'm officially not bored.
I read the list of things. Realistically, how do you explain what the Port Authority is to people you meet who aren't in that world of development?
Well, generally speaking, the mission here is for us to be proactive as a public source to identify opportunities for economic development and reach out to partner with the private sector. We are in between the governmental agencies themselves, who have a lot more legislation and less room to maneuver, and the private sector, who are sometimes limited in the amount of risk they can take. So ultimately what we can do is de-risk potential investments and partner with private developers to get things done faster.
Okay. And what is it that you think you bring to this? Because the port has been something that has been around, as I mentioned, for about 12 years now, 11
yes.
and a half, 12 years. And there has been promise, and then there's been problems about what was really being accomplished. And what do you bring? What do you think it is, based on that experience that you've got, that you can bring to this equation?
Well, first of all, looking backwards and having any criticism of the port is really almost irrelevant, because as you mentioned, the authority changed just very recently.
Right.
And once the local port authority had all the opportunities within the Ohio Revised Code, they didn't have funding. So you had an authority but no funding. So it took time for the board to secure the funding, and then that helped shape the kind of leadership that they're looking for. So really it is just a new beginning completely now. And I think I bring a very diverse background and set of skills that are somehow very uniquely qualified for this. It certainly is not the career I set out to have, but I think everything from my accounting and finance background to my management consulting, I've got a lot of experience in strategic planning, and then now the real estate development side, both from the sales aspect, from the brokerage firm, recognizing that you've got to have users and tenants, and you really have to drive business activity to where companies want to be. And then obviously from my time at Alnair, I now understand how real estate development works. So I think the professional aspect of my career has positioned me well. And then meanwhile, I've spent really 30 years since I graduated from college actively involved in the community. I have a lot of relationships that I've built, a lot of passion for the community, and a real desire to be a connector between all those different organizations. So I think I get to pull my civic career and my professional career together here.
In the list of all of those things under the Ohio Revised Code that were possible, and I kind of ticked them off real quick.
Right.
What do you see as, not just your vision, but the board's vision? What are the priorities moving forward, say in the next 2 to 5 years?
Well, what we have to do this year is really develop a plan. So this is premature to the plan, and I can't wait to share that plan with everybody once we have it developed. But the first things that we're going to explore are going back to the Go Cincinnati plan that was developed in 2008. That really was the motivation for the Port Authority to reorganize. And it is also the motivation for the funding that we're getting from the city. So the city is looking to us to go into the Go Cincinnati communities that are identified there, which are Madisonville, Queensgate, Bond Hill, and look for opportunities for redevelopment. So that's going to be a primary place where we start. The county, as you've read about this week, past week in the paper, is really focused on this land bank. That's something that that Todd Portune has been working on for quite a while. Cuyahoga County has been a leader in this for some time. So that is a program that we need to get our arms around to provide service to the entire county. And then meanwhile, I'm interviewing lots of our different stakeholders out in the community to find out what other opportunities there are. We need to come to grips with the role that the port is going to play within transportation. And that's a very broad set of possibilities. And we have to evaluate the real economic impact of the opening of the Panama Canal on our region, and do a thorough analysis to determine what those potentials are and what investment ought to be made, and whether, what role the Port Authority plays in that.
Well, this is probably the closest it comes to dealing with a port.
Yes,
so let's
exactly.
Let's explore this a little bit, because a lot of people may not think that they may have heard about Panama Canal renovations and expansion and not think it has much to do with Cincinnati.
Right.
How might it? What are the range of possibilities of steps that we might take that could leverage that sort of development?
Okay, you're asking me a pretty detailed question for 2 weeks on the job. However, at a very high level, the Panama Canal is going to be opened for a lot more traffic, international traffic. So there's the potential here for a significantly increased amount of barge traffic coming up through the Mississippi River rather than going around the coast. So getting products in and out of the Midwest may happen increasingly through the rivers rather than by rail or truck. And obviously, if we have increased traffic here, then there'll be opportunity for real estate activity along the river as well, not just the passage of barges through our community.
Well, one of the possibilities might be, and maybe I'll say this, and maybe you can elaborate if you want to, but if you look just west of the city along the river, and if you had an aerial view, the juxtaposition between the river and that huge rail yards behind Union Terminal, there has all kinds of possibilities with containerized ships to move containerized materials off of barges onto rail and get them to other places.
Absolutely. We're in a very key location within our country from a logistics standpoint, and we're underutilizing that. We're underutilizing the freight aspect of it, both by truck and by rail currently. And what we don't want to do is also underutilize the river aspect. So we do need to take an inventory of what our opportunities are and really do the risk-reward analysis. So you're exactly right. That would be the epicenter of where the activity would likely happen.
That's a really big thing out there.
It's a big thing, and we've got to get our hands around that. And it's certainly bigger than just the port, but the port will play a role in those activities and that decision making.
Well, at least it sounds like a port.
It sounds like a port.
So
I know. I've been to other cities where the port actually has buildings on the river.
Right. One traditional function for the Port Authority has been brownfield redevelopment. Will that continue to be?
Yes, absolutely. One of the roles for us to play is to de-risk potential sites and get them cycled back in for private development. And we have, when we look within our potential tax base within the city and the county, we have sites that are certainly underutilized, a lot of them contaminated because they're past manufacturing sites, and what we want to do is get those cycled back through.
And we're looking at some footage from the Stearns and Foster plant, which is one of those in urban areas. Getting sites that can be developed often means removing what's there and cleaning it. We're not out in rural areas where you can just put it in a cornfield.
Absolutely. And what we don't want to do is just have continued economic development go outside the Beltway. We want to bring that back within the city. What we're looking for are more jobs and more increased population.
Another thing I want to alert people's attention to is the role you played at Al Nyer, and because this really reflects, as I understand you, we don't know each other that well, but your role at Al Nyer with the redevelopment of the Vernon Manor. for Children's Hospital, and not just the building and the construction, but the ownership that you put together for that, and bringing minority owners in. Would you just say a little bit about that?
Well, and you'll like this because my story starts with Leadership Cincinnati.
I love it.
Yeah, you like that part. And I went through leadership in 1990-91, and it was at that time, during that experience, that I really developed a passion for inclusion, and have tried to work both in my professional life and in my civic life ever since then to find more potential opportunities. When I came into the real estate world in 2005, I really realized the lack of economic opportunity for wealth building and how that's not shared across races. And I started to explore that while I was at that time it was College Tony Martin Tucker, now Cassidy Turley, and did a fair amount of reach out and education during that time frame, really gathered information. But as I came to Alnire, I realized that's a place where I could make a difference. So I reached out to my good friend Ed Rigaud, and that led to meetings with Ed Jackson, and ultimately led to us putting together a book and going on the road and meeting with probably 35 different potential investors within the African American community for investment in that building. We ultimately ended up with 12 investors who put together an LLC that now currently own 51% of that project. And it led to lots of good relationship building and opportunities, and as I've said previously, it's the most gratifying thing I've done in my career.
And now we see a similar thing in connection with redevelopment of the old Job and Family Services site. Yes. For Christ Hospital.
Yes, exactly.
Similar model.
Similar model, yes.
Do you see taking that same sort of model of not just minority contracting, but
right.
minority ownership
right.
over to the Port Authority?
Absolutely, because what I've discovered here, my speech in the last few years has been, it's about the wealth gap. It's not just about the employment gap, it's about the wealth gap. And so we do have to really work hard within our community, and this goes back to what we decided we were really committed to do after the riots, was to make the wealth opportunities equal. And real estate is a driver for wealth throughout our country. And so yes, at the port, where we're a part of this economic opportunity building, and we're using public money, to a very great extent, the use of that ought to be shared, the benefit of that ought to be shared more broadly than it has been in the past. So I don't have the answer for the exact way we'll do it, but that is foundational to what my goals will be.
Laura, it's on that point that I think your hiring at the port can be a way of extending the sort of values that you've shown in other places, and can really make the Port Authority a real asset in this community going forward, not just because it redevelops things, but the way it does it. So good luck.
Thank you very much.
And we'll have you back as projects develop.
Good. I can't wait to have stories to tell.
Okay, very good.
Dan.
Stay tuned. The Republican presidential primary campaign has been fought far away, but a group of Cincinnatians traveled to New Hampshire to study the communication structure of the campaigns. Join me after the break for insight into what's coming our way.
Well, if his record was so great as governor of Massachusetts, why didn't you run for re-election?
Now I have the opportunity, I believe, to use the experience I have. You got a surprised look at your face. Wait, wait, it's still my time.
Are you going to tell people you're not going to run for re-election for president if you win?
The fact is, you had a very bad re-election rating. You dropped out of office.
Political campaigns are a torrent of words. To understand what lies behind those words, you cannot just look at the political or economic facts. You have to look at the communication strategies employed by the candidates. Welcome back. From a historian's perspective, the way that political candidates communicate their messages, their platforms, and most importantly themselves, has evolved in revolutionary ways over the last 230 years. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most brilliant and effective American writers, would be lost in a modern political debate. And the gangly, homely Abraham Lincoln wouldn't last as a viable candidate for even one television debate in 2012, no matter what he said. A group of UC students and their professor, traveled to New Hampshire the first week of January to study the communication styles and strategies of the candidates in the race for the Republican nomination. I am joined now by Cady Short-Thompson, a professor of communications and dean of the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash campus, and Katie Nemeth, a graduate student in communications at the university. Welcome to Newsmakers, and welcome back. We're taping on Friday morning. It's just about as cold here as it was in New Hampshire.
It's actually colder than it was there.
So, Katie, you have done this every year since 1996.
That's right.
Taking a group of students.
That's right.
And what do you say to the students that you're going to do when you get there?
Well, we let them know that we're going to be distributing questionnaires pretty much nonstop all week to political events, and we travel around the state to rallies and events pretty tirelessly throughout the week. So we're a lot like storm chasers, chasing the candidates throughout the state of New Hampshire, and it's exciting. We get to hear them speak and see the crowds and interact with people, and it's just a whole lot of up close and personal examination of the political process.
And Katie, what's on those questionnaires? What is it that you're seeking to identify from the people that you're talking with and interacting with?
Sure. Well, the surveys consist of a series of questions that folks are to answer on a 5-item Likert scale, which sounds like jargon, but just to gauge how strongly they agree or disagree with a statement. And the ultimate goal is to determine what people are looking for in a candidate, so what qualities about a candidate are most important to them when they're voting.
And have you had a chance to analyze those surveys yet? Or, I mean, you've just been back a few days. So
Not yet.
Not yet. Based on your experience, because you've done this multiple years, do you think what people are looking for has changed over time? Have you seen a trend?
Sure. This is a longitudinal study that started in 1988, so this is our 7th election to look at what it is people are looking for, and there's no question that it changes every single time, and it changes across the different partisan affiliations and genders and in many different ways. And so we know that we'll find some difference. However, we always find similarity as well. So there are 3 characteristics that we find over and over again. So for example, the candidates are always ideally honest. Honesty always plays at number 1. We always see that talking about the nation's problems in specific ways plays usually 2nd or 3rd. And then there's oftentimes a mix of other items that have to do with compassion or speaking about certain needs or about the nation's problems in a variety of ways.
Well, here, Katie, one of the things that in that realm of things, when we get into the full campaign, I don't think it's so true because it's retail politics in New Hampshire and in Iowa. But as we get into the larger states, certainly by March 6th when it comes to Ohio, and there are many states running that day, it's now on TV, and events themselves seem totally staged to me. And as a reporter for the last 30 years, now you go to an event and you've got the right people behind the candidates, and it's all so stiff, and people, even if people ask a question, it seems to me you usually get a pat answer. What was your observation in New Hampshire? How were different candidates doing?
Absolutely, great question. That's something we actually talked about a lot while we were in New Hampshire and attending the different rallies. Some candidates were very staged, and we heard the same 20-minute stump speech.
Who was staged?
I would say Romney, more than the other candidates, had a speech that seemed to work well for him that he used multiple times, that we heard, I would say, 2 or 3 times. In terms of candidates that spoke well on the fly, I would say Ron Paul speaks very well. That's not to say necessarily I think he's a better candidate, but in terms of...
Well, you're looking at this through the communication
Sure,
lens,
absolutely.
so that's what we're looking at here,
So Ron Paul seemed to speak very extemporaneously at times in both the debates that we watched and also at his rallies. But
One thing that's interesting is the backdrop oftentimes becomes very important in terms of the literal stage of being staged. And so one of the things that we found with Cady, as has happened to me in the past, is you can literally see that they're selecting different individuals based on a whole host of factors to sit or stand behind the candidate. And Cady, being, I think, youthful, and I think that they said, oh, let's have her in the backdrop a number of times. And she sat behind a couple of times, in fact, once, being asked to hold one of the signs, which she felt a little awkward because we weren't there to be supporters, we were there to be researchers. But it was an example of how often we've seen, whether it's a person of a certain background or in many events, we'll actually see a very intentional selection of audience members to stand behind the candidate.
In the blog that you wrote for Cincinnati.com, and some of those got published in the paper.
That's right.
You even made a point at one of those about the staging, and all of a sudden I lost my point.
It happened in Romney's event where we were asked, I was asked specifically to sit behind and then to be in the stairwell at the end to wave goodbye. So almost like we were a part of the same play, and I wasn't there to be in a play, I was there to be
But you also
reserved.
observed that the audiences that you were encountering were amazingly undiverse.
That's right.
And very white.
That's right. It's interesting, a number of people have brought up in response to the blog or to the articles that of course they're going to be far more homogeneous because the population of New Hampshire is. Well, I know that. I've been there for years, and I had actually mentioned that in my first article. However, I will say that some years they've been even more homogeneous than others, and this was the case this year. What we found over and over again was it was just a sea of white people in many of these audiences. And if you're used to being in a diverse audience or in a diverse workplace or even in a diverse family, it's a stark difference from my everyday life.
Cady, what did you think about, because this got commented on Cady's blog as well, about the use of wives and family, children particularly?
Another thing that we spoke a lot about in New Hampshire, I would say the wives were, it was interesting the way that they were used by the candidates, I would say. Communicatively and also kind of strategically. Oftentimes, and each candidate kind of indicated or dealt with his wife differently, I would say. Some, for example, Newt Gingrich, his wife stood next to him for each of the speeches that we saw.
Did she ever speak?
The town halls. We did hear her speak
Once.
a few times.
Did she? Okay.
She did.
By request.
The other thing we've noticed is they often will say something to the effect of, "Look at my beautiful wife," which we thought was a little bit weird in terms of communication, I would say, but it was certainly interesting to see the differences in how each candidate spoke about their wife.
One of the things I heard reported on NPR was New Hampshire residents who were saying, "I am sick of," not the candidates, of robocalls at home. You know, we get 6 of them from Romney a day type of thing. From a communications perspective, was it robocalls or other things that there's a point of diminishing returns where you end up offending people rather than convincing people? Do you have any insight?
Well, I don't know about you, but in Ohio, I receive about 17 to 20 robocalls as the election approaches, and frankly, I don't even listen to them. I just immediately delete them. So not only are they not necessarily persuasive, but they're not even, earning one listen from the recipient. So, I can't imagine that many people listen. And I'll never forget, they'll employ some pretty major figures. I had Arnold Schwarzenegger calling me one year, and Chris Rock called me one year, and it's kind of funny to have that person on your voicemail, but not very effective in terms of political communication.
It is interesting though, because for a number of years, my mother-in-law lived with us, and I can remember coming home one day and she said, and I don't remember who the person was, whether it was somebody that she was impressed by. So-and-so called me today. I mean, she didn't recognize it as a robocall.
Right.
She never got a word in edgewise.
It makes a better story.
What was the most surprising thing that for you, Cady, that you weren't expecting?
Sure, great question. I suppose knowing myself and knowing how sometimes I respond to like telemarketing calls, and when I'm asked to take a survey at a restaurant, sometimes it's just easier to say no, I don't have the time, or no, I'm not interested. But in New Hampshire, people were very friendly and very willing to help us in our research, which I think was really neat. People, for the most part, were very welcoming. Everywhere we went, people said, "Welcome to our state, welcome to New Hampshire." So I suppose I was surprised by people's openness and friendliness and willingness to help us.
Someone asked me what our response rate was, and I said, well, we don't actually count it that way, but I would honestly estimate about 97%. I know that only one day did I have someone refuse my questionnaire, and that's pretty unusual, as you know.
Even in past years?
Oh, absolutely.
So
Far more people were willing to share this year, and I got little question. In fact, more often than not, we experienced that we would, be talking to one of the people in the audience, and not only would they accept, but they would recruit their whole aisle to fill it out. And so they'd pass it out like I am a professor, and so they'd pass it out and hand the pencils down the aisle, and they were quite helpful, actually.
We're just about out of time, but are you going to do something similar in the Ohio primary?
I don't have plans to do that. This is always focused on the early primary campaigns. We probably will pay close attention, and we've thought about doing that just to compare what might the results look like.
Yeah. Well, this has been. I hope this has been a great experience for you. And,
Absolutely.
And I hope you can stick with it because politics is fascinating. It's
Yes,
absolutely
it is.
fascinating.
I agree.
Thank you for being here. Thanks for doing it.
Absolutely.
Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Next week, I'll be joined for the entire show by James Craig, the new Cincinnati Chief of Police. Have a good week.